Kia ora tātou. It's usually this time in these conferences when they bring along an artist for comic relief. I was intrigued to hear that Alexander Gillespie had been to art school, and it's great to see that one of us had made it. I'm interested in these questions of inclusion and exclusion that we'd been talking about. Like many of us in Aotearoa, my experience of sculpture, or Western sculpture, came in the form of war memorials. Unless you lived in the city centres, of course, you would not see Western sculpture or figurative sculpture. It always came in the form of obelisks. And of course, it's interesting, that tradition of obelisks themselves, which comes not from Europe, but indeed from Africa, from Egypt, all of those wonderful obelisks stolen and taken to centres like Paris and London. So this was my experience of Western sculpture growing up, an obelisk outside my primary school in Manurewa. We've seen this already today, but going to university, this was the same story, of course, seeing such obelisks and the words inscribed on them, in this case, not to the Anzacs, but to the land wars, New Zealand wars, Te Riri Pākehā, take your pick. But the words were always about exclusion. When they refer to the friendly Māori, of course, they're not referring to those of us who descend from the tribes that were forced to fight the government, such as Waikato or Taranaki or other tribes. So whenever we looked at monuments like this, we were aware that we were excluded because we weren't deemed friendly. Avril Bell was here, I saw earlier, wrote so eloquently like this in an article called "The Truth is Not Set in Stone." But I think it's timely, or past time, that something be done about these unabashedly colonial memorials. As Vincent O'Malley says, history changes. We revise the historical interpretations of the past to reflect the concerns of the present. As society changes, so do our historical accounts. History is political, and so too are our monuments. They are established in celebration of the political status quo at the time of their erection, 1920 in this case. I quote academics to sound intelligent. My response at art school at the time was to make a work like this. This is called Exodus of a Pharaoh, or Pharaoh. And so it was made in 1987. Again, an obelisk, but it was, in this case, to the unfriendly Māori. So Exodus of a Pharaoh, as I say, Pharaoh is a pun on Te Whero, the first Māori king, and the fact that he was exiled after Raupatu to the lands of Maniapoto. So again, trying to change the narrative, turn these narratives around on their head. This is an obelisk from Omarunui in Hawke's Bay. And it was part of an exhibition by Jono Rotman. I found it fascinating because he was engaging with the Battle of Omarunui, or the so-called Battle of Omarunui, and it's an engagement that I'd never heard of. Although I've had a keen interest in Te Riri Pākehā, the land wars, I'd never come across this story, so I'd like to think I was relatively neutral when looking at these stories. So on one hand, you had the story about how under Colonel Whitmore, a group of hostile Hoho and Ngāti Hineuru were surrounded because they had the intention of invading Napier. They were surrounded just outside of Napier and asked what their intentions were, and when they didn't respond appropriately, they were killed or exiled to the Chatham Islands. So that's one version of the story. The other, and I read all of the accounts, and it sort of repeated the same story, so I found it quite intriguing. But then reading between the lines and reading the correspondence and also understanding the mindset of MacLean, a Scotsman, it became obvious that he had sent them correspondence, some of them to town, to announce their allegiance to the Queen Victoria. And so after summoning them, they were then surrounded and then engaged in this encounter called the Battle of Omarunui. Anyway, this is the work of John O'Rourke, and he's also talking about this history of Omarunui. And on the one case, he has Whitmore, and he has the friendly chiefs. It's part of this mythology that they came together that we like to perpetuate in New Zealand, that the settlers and the friendlies came together to defeat those unfriendly Māori, or bad Māori in this case, here represented by the obelisk. An obelisk that had been shattered and broken by descendants of potentially the bad Māori. Jono also has done a series on the mongrel mob, where he writes, by revealing the strains and legacies of a colonised and bicultural society, both series have led me to consider more closely my own relationship as a fifth-generation Pākehā to the history of modern New Zealand. So I had the opportunity to exhibit in the same space and created these works. So these were called monuments to the properties of peace and evil. When the unfriendly Māori had been asked to surrender, their leader, Pānapa, had replied with the elusive response, peace is a property and evil is a property. O he taonga te kino, he taonga te pai. So I wanted to make these works slightly fragile and out of wood to suggest the enclosure that they'd been in when this encounter took place, which is described as a fortification or a pa in some context, some historical writings about Omarunui. But in actual fact, it was a papakainga, so there was nothing fortified about this structure and no reason for them to attack. And this is the statement. So messages were sent into the Ho fortification. And this was his response. He taonga te kino, he taonga te pai, ka mutu te kōrero. Peace is a property and evil is a property. And it's interesting that phrase, ka mutu te kōrero, was translated as now talking is at an end, which is very finite, and sealed the fates of those within this pa. This was a work called Monument, made in 2018 in June. And I wanted to make a memorial to Te Puia. So this monument actually represents everything she stood against, but however, I wanted to represent her story, because in a lot of the dialogues about Anzacs and the great Anzac tradition, of course, you have Waikato are not represented in those stories because Te Puia refused conscription. So we all had sort of monument fatigue and commemoration fatigue by that year, 2019, after 4 years of commemorating the battles in World War I. However, I thought it was appropriate to make a monument to Te Puia and her stance against conscription. So as I see it, it sort of represents everything that she stood against. And it takes the form of a redoubt or a fortification. And at that time, I became interested in the stories of inclusion and exclusion, who's included in our history and who's not, and became fascinated by the events that led to the Waikato confiscations. So we mentioned, for example, Vincent mentioned today Thomas Russell, and he was one of many Auckland speculators that benefited from the war. So after advocating for the invasion of Waikato, they immediately benefited from it with large estates. And of course, he also established, as was mentioned today, the BNZ Bank and also other notable New Zealand institutions, such as New Zealand Insurance. So he created these institutions, but then they excluded Māori because Māori couldn't go to them for a loan to develop their farms and estates. So they're very much dependent on the wealth of Waikato land, and then excluded Waikato from developing their land and being part of the nation. So again, questioning the second monument that I showed you that talked about the friendlies versus the unfriendly Māori. And of course, Te Puia was wise to know that all of that land, of course, eventually would be used like this establishment in Durie in South Auckland, very close to where many of these engagements occurred. So it's fascinating for me, growing up in Manurewa. My father taught at Papakura High School, always having to go through Takanini. And of course, Takanini was the chief whose land was confiscated in that place that Vincent mentioned today. Forced off after they tried to get him to sign a proclamation to Queen Victoria. And then imprisoned. It's interesting, it was also raised that notion of Anzac. You know, I don't think in any way Vincent and others who talk about the Waikato Wars are trying to displace Anzac. However, I think it's intriguing when you live in a city like Auckland. I think it's important to know where the wealth originally came from. You know, you think of the gold mining in Coromandel, speculators moving from there to Waikato, the confiscated land, and then up north to cut down every kauri tree they could possibly come across. That provided the wealth of Auckland. I don't think it hurts to know those stories. And of course, even looking at the Anzac mythology itself, you come across books like this, Jeff Hopkins' Wise Blood Brothers, that talks quite adamantly about how the Anzac tradition did not start at Gallipoli. It started in the swamps of Waikato. When he writes the true birthplace of the Australian-New Zealand military tradition that would become known as the Adject legend. By the middle of the 19th century, the very existence of the European colonial settlement in New Zealand was threatened. So, I mean, the complete exaggerations, as we heard today, you know, why would Waikato strangle the golden goose? Depended so heavily on trade on Auckland, it made no sense to invade. But interesting that that notion, one, as I say, of inclusion, exclusion, and who's friendly, who's not, by telling these stories. And of course, you see that reinforced in monuments like this, Anzac monuments, this one at Mercer. So this came off a gunship that was built in Sydney called Pioneer. And what's intriguing to me is the presence of O Pioneer, of course, is reminiscent of the wars in Waikato, but then it's on top of it you have this World War I soldier. And so if you like, it's commemorating those victories over all of our enemies, domestic and international, whether they be Turks or Waikato Māori. So anyway, in an exhibition called Tai Moana Tai Tangata, which I recently had in Taranaki, I decided to look at this monument and the history of these monuments. So I live in Waiuku. I drive past that monument at Mercy every second day. If I'm not doing that, drive further afield. Upon Te Whirowhiro's past site was gloriously placed the other gun turret to remind the locals of who won that war. So I decided in this exhibition to make a sculpture that referred to that tradition, so it's called O Pioneer. As I say, one of the other ironies of the monument at Mercer is the fact that it's very close to Te Paenga, where Te Puia took that stance, and her men were taken away to be in prison. So this work, colloquially people call it the wedding cake. So I'm talking about other strategies of assimilation, such as marriage, that resulted in people like myself. But the overall message is that behind, I used to go into my grandparents' place, my Paenga grandparents' place, or my Māori grandparents' place, and see very different things. And in the Paenga grandparents, you'd see doilies and all of these things, the beautiful Victorian ceiling panels or Victorian wallpaper. So the basic statement is that behind all those elements of civility came a lot of violence, or was perpetuated by violence. And then in the foreground of that, this is at the Gavet Brewster in Taranaki, I had a tapestry. And on that tapestry were sewn, or my version of all of the flags of the British regiments that fought in Waikato and Taranaki. So I had the numbers of the regiments and then the flags themselves for the Taranaki iwi to walk on. Did I say that? I was conscious of the fact that at St. Mary's, just up the road, you still had the military hatchments in the space in the church there. And also at Marsland Hill, which is just above the art gallery, you had a monument which originally had a colonial soldier on it, which had all the regiments listed. So this was also done after the Christchurch massacre, and the protagonist was playing British military pipe music on his way to do what he did. So I was sort of looking at that legacy of the British Army and how much we'd romanticise that mythology that in our country. Here's the hatchments. Strangely enough, this one is actually the 14th, which was from Buckinghamshire, where my mother's ancestors come from. She wouldn't be very impressed if she knew that. Last Thursday, speaking about the Taranaki engagement, I was lucky enough to attend the whare hononga, or the opening of the whare hononga. But also at that, but also at that time, Ngāti Haua had gone down. Ngāti Haua had, the tribe had sent warriors to an engagement, or sent them down after much debate in Waikato to the Taranaki campaign. In the call of Wiramukiengi, they'd gone down there under Wetini and died at a place called Māhoitahi. So this photo, which was literally a week ago, shows their descendants who have come together with Te Atiawa to remember that battle at Māhoitahi. So someone mentioned today how alive these things were in the Māori mind, and I absolutely concur with that. It's as if the ancestors died yesterday when they're spoken about. It has a happy ending, my conclusion. So this is the whare hononga. So outside of St. Mary's Church in New Plymouth, this was the vision of Sir Paul Reeves. This is Jade Ruka, who's the minister, one of the ministers there now, but it was the vision of Sir Paul Reeves, to build a whare of reconciliation, a whare hononga. And so I was lucky enough to be there last Thursday. So this place is outside of St. Mary's, which has not had a great relationship with Te Atiawa and the Ngāti Tawhiti in the past, because of the graveyards and the hanging of the hatchments and all the military regalia associated with that place. So it was Sir Paul's dream that people could come together and talk about these issues and talk about what had happened, the confiscation of land, and be a place of healing. And so, as I say, I was lucky enough to go down there last weekend when this was open. And of course, after the structure's built, they're looking forward to all of that hard work ahead of them where they can engage in these type of wānanga. Yeah, so kia ora rā tātou.